Level 989.
Welcome to 989 on Health, a show where you don't need years at university to understand the latest news about health and related subjects.
An important announcement for our listeners. This podcast is intended to be an informal tool for laymen and practitioners alike to hear our viewpoints on health and wellness. Don't rely on the information in this podcast as an alternative to medical advice from your doctor or other professional healthcare provider. For the full disclaimer, please see our website.
I'm Mike Davalos, just a guy, an average Joe, and I'm joined by the opposite of average, Brandon Weintraub, a primary care physician. Good morning, Brandon.
And good morning, Mike. I hope you're up to date on your television.
I am, actually. Why do you say?
Why do I say? Because of today's topic.
Oh, right. I'm like, are we talking about Westworld? What's going on? Our topic for today is something a little different. We're talking about medical TV shows. Some people might say they're just another type of drama or comedy or dramedy for that matter, depending on the show. But I think the average viewer picks up a lot of important information when they're watching a medical show. Every week the shows need new sick people to treat, and these people have diseases. And seeing the doctors discuss and treat health problems on screen helps to demystify a lot of illnesses. They seem a lot less unknown and scary. One of the most important things you learn watching medical shows is the fact that doctors and nurses and other healthcare professionals are real people with lives and problems. Their personal time and relationships are hugely impacted or destroyed by long hours. They're always on call. They're stuck in the red tape of insurance and pharmaceutical companies and the legal system, even more so than we are as patients. And these professionals suffer a lot more stress and uncertainty than you're allowed to see while you're getting treated. Brandon, I'm older than you, so I know we're going to have different answers for this. What's the earliest medical show you remember watching regularly?
The first medical show I remember watching was called Doogie Howser MD. It was a show about a young boy with a medical mind of astonishing power, who became a doctor at the tender age of 9, or 10, depending on which source you look at.
I remember watching a few random episodes of Doogie back in the day. I remember it being pretty good for its time. For the United States, the first medical show I found a reference to was something called City Hospital, which first aired in 1951. And we'll have links to all these shows that we mention at our website, level989.com/health. There were a handful of medical shows that followed, but nothing that really caught the attention of the public until Dr. Kildare came along in 1961. Which was based on radio shows and movies from the 1930s, with the TV version starring a very young Richard Chamberlain, and the program ran until 1966. Now, Brandon, I don't expect you to remember Dr. Kildare, but how about Richard Chamberlain? Towering Inferno, The Thornbirds, Alan Quatermain in The Lost City of Gold.
Well, I have to admit, I definitely don't know a thing about Dr. Kildare. I seem to think they made a comic book of it. This was all kind of just a tiny bit before my time. According to the ever-truthful and helpful Wikipedia, the show aired about some 20-odd years before I was born. And Chamberlain's an actor, right? I think I've heard the name. At the very least, I've heard of Alan Quatermain, although his adventures in the Lost City of Gold may have eluded me at present.
Well, according to Wikipedia, which cannot be trusted, in order to create realistic scripts for Dr. Kildare, the series writer spent several months working alongside interns in a large hospital. Episodes frequently highlighted diseases or medical conditions that hadn't been widely discussed on television, including drug addiction, sickle cell anemia, and epilepsy. There's even episodes about venereal disease, which were personally requested by President Lyndon B. Johnson, and the birth control pill. These episodes were written but never produced due to network objections. Technical advice was provided by the American Medical Association, whose name appeared at the end credits of each episode. It seems a bit odd that the president could request an episode and it would actually get written, but then blocked by the network. You think the president could have helped get that past the censors. Speaking of sickle cell anemia, I don't think I have a good grasp on what that is, even now. Off the top of my head, I think it's red blood cells that don't have the typical shape. So that causes problems with blood oxygenation, I think. But it might also help the person resist malaria. Do I have that right?
You do indeed. The key factor in sickle cell disease is hemoglobin. It's a protein that's found in red blood cells, which binds to oxygen and helps carry it throughout the body. Red blood cells that contain normal hemoglobin are generally disc-shaped. It's a shape that's pretty flexible, and it allows the red blood cells to easily flow through large and small blood vessels. Sickle hemoglobin don't always retain that donut-like shape, and instead will sometimes form stiff, rod-like structures, which change the red blood cell into a crescent or a sickle shape. Sickled red blood cells can stick to the walls of blood vessels, and that can create blockages and cut off vital oxygen supply from various organs. I remember reading a few studies about these sickled cells and their connection to malaria. The precise nature of the protection mechanism isn't completely understood. The increased rate of destruction of sickled cells, decreased infectability of the abnormally shaped cells, even microRNA adjustments to the malarial organism is a possibility.
As usual, medical things are much more complex than you realize. But oddly enough, there was another popular doctor show that ran at the same period as Dr. Kildare, and that was Ben Casey. Maybe the public was just finally ready for doctor shows, though some said the shows were as much soap opera as medical drama. If ER and Grey's Anatomy can be accused of being soapy, maybe it's just a tried and true part of the medical show pedigree. The two shows examined 1960s medical culture from different angles, with Kildare being more from the point of view of a naive resident and Casey being a more serious, experienced surgeon. Both points of view had a lot to teach audiences about what goes on in a hospital. It might be hard for younger listeners to realize this, but until quite recently, many folks had little or no exposure to hospitals or healthcare workers for most of their lives. Get a load of this. In the U.S., in 1938, 50% of all people were born at home. So if you were a 30-year-old person watching Casey or Kildare airing in the 1960s, there was a 50% chance that you had not been born in a hospital, and possibly had never been in a hospital or seen a doctor. Interestingly, by 1950, only 1% of people were born at home. It's highly possible that many people only went to the hospital at or near the time of death, if they went even then. Brandon, home births seems like they would be, a lot less stressful for the mother. Is there some reason home births are a bad idea, or do they just fall out of fashion? I mean, women managed to give birth for thousands of years without doctors around.
I'm really glad you asked this question. This particular topic, and really any that deal directly with birth in general, are worth thinking about. Home birth versus hospital birth is a hot-button topic. When I've had this discussion with the practitioners in the past, I found that there are some intense feelings, and their thoughts are often put in terms of technology versus nature, as if there was a need for a bare-knuckled and to-the-death brawl to decide which is better. You're right in saying that births have been going on without doctors present in a hospital setting for some time, but in most cases a professional, whether they're trained and licensed by an organization or in a less organized way prior to the systemization of medical sciences. There was always someone to assist with the birth. Home births in the United States almost always occur, at least in this day and age, with the presence of a certified midwife or a nurse practitioner or maybe a doctor on hand to assist with the birth. There appear to be some risks associated with home birth, a 2 to 3-fold increase in risk of neonatal death, for example. But there are benefits as well. The CDC published a report that showed 6% of babies born at home were preterm, as compared with 12% of babies born in hospitals.
So does this mean that home births are a good idea or a bad idea?
For those pregnant women who are in fairly good health and willing to take more responsibility for their health and their child's health and their postnatal care, and for those who are willing to make sure to find a certified midwife or similar practitioner, a home birth may be a great benefit. Cost also plays a significant role. Hospital births can be expensive, even though they're covered by insurance, and a home birth often mitigates a lot of that expense, although the patient will then be required to pay most of their costs out of pocket, since at present time I think there's only 4 states that require insurance payouts for midwives. All that said, my suggestion is to make sure you're screened by your physician or specialist to see how fit you are for the possibility of a home birth, and just make sure to clearly discuss your plans with your practitioner.
Reading the synopsis of these Kildare and Casey episodes have shown me that while technology has improved in the last 50 or 60 years, human nature, people's passions and weaknesses are the same. And the unfortunate issues of medicine as big business have only become worse over time. Is there any sign that this vicious medical money cycle is going to be broken anytime soon?
I know I brought up in past episodes my misgivings about the way Western medicine is headed. Insurance and medical costs, excessive litigation, pharmaceutical control over legal policy, and even over physicians' treatment choices. There's a lot of money being made, and there are a lot of companies and individuals who have too much to lose if something significant changes. Everything requires investment, I know. Money makes the world go round. But the way things are right now is putting practitioners in a really tricky spot. Even those who want to put their patients first are finding themselves being forced into uncomfortable choices. To even become a physician, there's a significant cost in both time and money. So before many doctors even try to find their first office space, they're already in a fair amount of debt. With all these factors weighing down on the modern physician, I have to say that medicine is likely to be seen as big business for a long time to come.
The next show that stands out on the timeline is Marcus Welby MD, which aired from 1969 to 1976. Now, I was born in 1971, and while the name Marcus Welby is definitely familiar to me, I don't actually remember the show itself. According to Wikipedia, its handling of many varied medical cases, some common, some uncommon, made it an instant hit for ABC. Storylines include impotence, depression, brain damage, breast cancer, mononucleosis, sexually transmitted diseases, epilepsy, learning disabilities, leukemia, dysautonomia, rape, Alzheimer's disease, and addiction to painkillers, among other things. Now, most of these ring a bell with me, but what is infectious mononucleosis and dysautonomia? Medical advisor, advise!
Well, I'm willing to bet you know more about infectious mononucleosis than you think. It's more commonly known as mono, the kissing disease, because the virus involved can spread through saliva. In the US, serious complications are extremely rare, and the most common symptoms are fever, swollen lymph nodes, and a sore throat. Dysautonomia, and that's quite a tongue twister, isn't a single disorder. The word describes a number of conditions which affect the autonomic nervous system, and that's the system that controls automatic bodily functions like your heartbeat or breathing.
Oh, that's scary. I came across some interesting controversy when it comes to Marcus Welby. In response to the 1973 episode, The Other Martin Loring, about a middle-aged man whom Welby advised to resist his homosexual impulses, the Gay Activists Alliance picketed ABC's New York headquarters. The next year, another episode, The Outrage, sparked nationwide demonstrations because its story of a teenage student being sexually assaulted by his male teacher conflated homosexuality with pedophilia. 7 sponsors refused to buy television advertising time, and 17 network affiliates refused to air the episode. It was the first known instance of network affiliates refusing a network episode in response to protests. Now, I have lived a very sheltered life growing up in the 70s, but I had no idea that homosexuality or pedophilia existed at all, let alone that it was being played out on primetime dramas in the early 70s. There were general warnings of don't talk to strangers, but the vague concept I was given was that I'd be kidnapped and I don't know what, held for ransom. There was never any indication that inappropriate touching, or far worse, was even a possibility. I assume that modern kids have a far better understanding of the dangers than I did. Now, you grew up in a totally different decade than I did. How was your experience different?
Well, first of all, I think that the sense of vagueness you received was probably intentional, and is probably still intentional regardless of the decade. The important thing is to make sure children know what they ought to be concerned about, and what to do about any given situation. If you give them too many details, and especially to someone who's too young to really understand what they're being told, it's not going to help much. From what I remember, the warnings were still vague, but I do feel like I was given a better idea of the dangers than you're describing you were given.
I don't think it was until 7th grade, which was sometime in the 1980s, that we had sex education. But even then, it was all grainy film strips of heterosexual anatomy lessons about hormones, the penis, the vagina, pubic hair, and fallopian tubes. I don't think I'd even heard of homosexuality outside of one example. And here comes another TV reference, Billy Crystal's character on Soap. And I missed the initial run, so I was watching Soap in the mid-80s. At that point, I was aware of one gay person on the planet, which sounds very lonely for him. We may well have an entire episode on this at some point, but sex education seems to vary widely by state. But it seems to me that some types of sex education should start a lot sooner than 7th grade. There's so much to understand about the possibilities of gender variations, orientations, just acceptance of other people's preferences and philosophies, just to teach the concept of open-mindedness. I think a lot of that should start in preschool, even if we save the particulars of anatomy and physical sex until much later. Now, neither you or I are parents, so it's doubly hard for us to say what people should be teaching their kids. But what do you think? That was a long ramble, so let me clarify. I know it's not your area of expertise, but just give me your quick take on this sort of sex education.
Unfortunately, this is another one of those hot-button topics that isn't likely to have an easy, clear-cut answer, especially if you were looking for something like, yes, of course, we should start teaching our children about this sort of thing as early as possible. I tend to be a bit more open in my approach into information in general. If you know something, provide the information to anyone and everyone. To me, it's up to the individual to be able to sort through what's right, what's wrong, and how they're going to determine the difference. When it comes to sexual education, there are legitimate concerns about introducing knowledge too soon. Until they reach a certain level of maturity, young children aren't capable, and it has nothing to do with not being old enough to learn, but about the experiences and level of cognitive and emotional development needed to have their own interpretation of sex and the complexities involved. Until they reach that level of maturity, children can't draw their own conclusions about what's right or wrong or okay. And until they reach that level of maturity, children rely on their role models to help guide them, in small steps, towards healthy sexual development. The problem with your view that children ought to be taught tolerance and understanding of other people's worldview is that, in some cases, people don't hold the same view as to what ought to be taught and tolerated. I agree with you entirely. The goal of teaching today's youth to be understanding of people, sexual preference, gender types notwithstanding, it should be a no-brainer. But who has the right to decide what ought to be acceptable and what ought to be taught? The national government? State government? Preschool teachers of each individual class? The parents? Tolerance, understanding, open-mindedness, these are all wonderful goals to strive for. And children, at least in the US, are actually beginning to reach puberty and sexual maturity at younger and younger ages. There was actually a report in the Wall Street Journal recently which states that it's not unusual to begin seeing signs of puberty at age 7. So clearly there's a need to start introducing children to key concepts earlier than we have been. The tricky part is going to be to decide how much we can teach and in what kind of depth.
Alright, back to the TV show timeline. I have vague memories of a show called Emergency, which aired from 1972 to 1979. The program was largely about paramedics, which was still something of a new idea at the time. This sounds odd to think about, but the idea that the ambulance crew were going to be an active part of your healthcare, using the defibrillator, getting you started on an IV, giving you an injection, these things really weren't done before 1969. Think about that. Before the late 60s, the ambulance crew were basically just loading you up and rushing you to the hospital, hoping to get you there before you died. There's a scene in the time travel show 11/22/63. For those who haven't heard of the show, it's about a guy from 2016 who goes back in time to 1963 to try to prevent the Kennedy assassination. Anyway, there's a scene where the ambulance arrives and the guy from our present day is there in 1963. He's yelling at the ambulance crew to start trauma treatment for his injured lady friend, and the ambulance crew are quite surprised by this. They don't have the training or equipment or permission to actually intervene. Speaking of paramedic intervention, have you heard about the new developments? There's a lot of talk about, in some situations, modern-day paramedics putting a victim into some sort of suspended animation to keep them from dying on the way to the hospital. Is this already happening, or is this just another one of those someday soon medical miracles?
I had heard about this from a friend who was a paramedic, actually. As I understand it, we're a long way off from a suspended animation device being deployed in the field. I do know that a non-mobile version, for use in a hospital setting, was supposed to have entered human trials recently. The technology needed to make a mobile, field-stable, automated version that could be used quickly by a paramedic in the field will be waiting for a fair number of advancements. I think we can put the idea safely in the someday soon category.
But I have to admit, I barely remember Emergency. The first medical show that had an impact on me was MASH. I assume you've at least heard of it? What do you remember about MASH?
I do remember MASH. Of course, the iconic final episode, "It wasn't a chicken! It wasn't a chicken!" sticks out in my mind. More generally, I remember a smarmy and smart-aleck field surgeon doing his best to make sense of medicine in the middle of a wartime environment.
Was it a turkey? For those of you who may be too young to remember, MASH is a very weird mix of a show, of a location, of a comedy, and a drama. It's set in Korea during the Korean War, which was from 1950 to 1953. It's centered around a mobile army surgical hospital, which is where the acronym for MASH comes from. And it's this great concept involving these newly developed high-tech flying machines called helicopters, which would bring in wounded American soldiers from the front lines of battle to get skilled surgical intervention very quickly compared to just a few years earlier in World War II. In fact, a seriously wounded soldier who made it to a MASH unit alive had a greater than 97% chance of survival once he received treatment. Now, the show was using Korea as an analog for the Vietnam War, and for me at least, MASH did a great job of demonstrating how futile war could be and what kind of horrible things it could do to your body. I think it cured me of any of the typical teenage male red badge of courage type delusions I might have had. I've always been something of a klutz anyway, but MASH made me realize that if I ever went to war, if I was very, very lucky, I was going to get some part of me blown clean off. And some crazed but brilliant, half-drunk, giggling, crying doctor would be picking bits of shrapnel out of my liver while simultaneously flirting with nurses. The show could be very silly at times, but then in the next moment very real and tragic, and something about this silliness made the tragedy more realistic somehow. It's a great show, and I highly recommend it.
It wasn't a chicken!
Okay, I think we better move on from MASH. How about this? Another show I definitely remember is Quincy, Medical Examiner. Have you heard of this one, Brandon?
I haven't. I'm sorry. I haven't heard of this one either.
I thought not. It's a lot less well-known than MASH, but it aired from 1976 to 1983, and it had the great Jack Klugman as a medical examiner with no first name. Well, not one that was ever revealed during the show, at least. This show is a lot like Bones, with Emily Deschanel and David Boreanaz is now a medical forensics professional solving murders. But Quincy worked alone. He didn't have a vampire from the 18th century helping him out. Sorry, that was a David Boreanaz reference. Anyway, every week the cops would, they want to take the quick and easy way out. Look, Doc, the bullet wound to the chest is clearly the cause of death, huh? But Quincy would gather small details from the autopsy that made him believe the simple answer wasn't the correct one, and he'd go out and do his own investigating. So, what do you think about this? You and me, we make our own new show, but this savvy young acupuncturist who heals by day and solves crimes by night. Brendan Weintraub is the Needleist. Needles dipped in nightshade bring bitter sleep to the evildoers of Gainesville, Florida. You might need a not-so-savvy sidekick. Mike Davalos is the Porcupine. I would totally...
Oh, okay. That's good.
Okay, fine. We'll talk about it later. I have more on Quincy. It was actually a pretty interesting and relevant show for its time. In fact, the writers introduced a lot of social responsibility type themes. Airline safety, hazardous waste, anorexia, drunk driving laws. Quincy was one of the first dramatic series to use a format like this to further a social agenda. Jack Klugman himself even came to testify before the U.S. Congress about some of these issues, such as orphan drugs in 1982, describing what he'd learned about a difficult or complex social concern as a result of its use in one of the show's episodes. Brandon, what are orphan drugs?
So, orphan drugs are pharmaceutical products that are intended for use in diagnosis, prevention, or treatment of a disease or disorder that's extremely rare. An orphan drug's development might be abandoned if it was determined that the economic return on that drug would be insufficient to merit its further study, and that's a very sad state of affairs. However, there are other ways a pharmaceutical might earn the orphan drug status. Thalidomide, for example. It was a drug that was initially marketed and used as a sedative or a hypnotic. Well, it earned itself an orphan status as a result of the discovery of its negative side effects for many patients. But in rare instances, it has positive effects on other illnesses, such as leprosy. And so thalidomide still provides potential benefit to a small subset of people. I'll stop with details there, but we'll go ahead and provide a link at our website for anyone interested in learning more about orphan drugs.
It's really weird to think that leprosy is still something that's a problem in the world. You kind of think of it lumped in with like bubonic plague as some historical illness.
Something that is long gone.
Yeah.
And it's scary to think that a drug that had as many negative side effects, especially for unborn children, like thalidomide, can be applied and have positive effects on leprosy. It's crazy.
There are a lot of medical shows we're skipping. We could do a whole series of episodes if we wanted to cover every medical show that's ever been made. But a few stood out while I was doing the research, and those are the ones we're going to cover. Which brings us to Northern Exposure, which came out in 1990. This one was set in a small fictional town of Sicily, Alaska, and featured a newly graduated doctor from New York City who showed up to work off his education costs, which had been paid for by a wealthy landowner there in Sicily. Some areas of Alaska are pretty remote, and they can find it hard to find and keep a doctor. A big part of the early episodes are about the culture shock of a New Yorker being thrust into this quiet town in the middle of nowhere. But there's also a lot about a new doctor trying to earn the trust of his patients, most of whom are Alaska Native or First Nations people. He needs to learn how to interact with and lead even a small staff, how to manage with meager equipment and supplies. It was an offbeat show, and I remember enjoying it quite a bit. I especially enjoyed the bush pilot played by Janine Turner. I always thought she was super cute, and interestingly enough, she later played Dr. Dana Stowe on the series Strong Medicine for 6 seasons. Where was I? Sexy bush pilot, short hair, super cute. I think again, Northern Exposure teaches the lesson that it's all about the people, not about big city hospitals and equipment, but the need to understand your patients and actually talk with them, work with what you have. What do you think? Would you be willing to ship off to foreign countries, do some sort of Doctors Without Borders type thing? I know you're not an MD, but even if they weren't interested specifically in your Chinese medicine skills at first, there's still a lot of help you could give.
It's a tough life to live, that medicine that you're describing. As a medical provider here in the States, I have a very unique situation. I have regular access to supplies, travel is usually fairly simple, and if there's a significant emergency, there's rarely a distance so great that a helicopter can't rush the patient to a nearby medical center equipped with better facilities. I don't know that I have the temperament to handle a Doctors Without Borders situation. I know that even basic skills and materials, along with a touch of empathy, and the will to carry on the best you can, makes a huge difference in the lives of the people who have no other options. But the frustration of seeing a group of people in need of what might be considered even the most basic necessities to improve their health tenfold, and then knowing I can't provide them, would be very difficult for me. Even so, I have seen how much of a difference it can make when a physician takes the time to just listen and provide helpful feedback.
One show we can't miss talking about, and one that almost everyone's going to remember, is Scrubs, which aired from 2001 to 2010. It's hard to believe it's already been 6 years since it went off the air. The show is a comedy. It's about a group of young doctors and nurses and all the hijinks they get into. There are lots of very funny asides where Dr. Dorian is imagining all these crazy scenes, the silly sort of places your mind really goes during an average day. Just all part of the safety valve of dealing with the stress and staying sane by not taking yourself too seriously. In a way, Scrubs is the most MASH-like show since the actual MASH, in so much that the doctors seemed like real people to me. Though while there were often touching moments in Scrubs, there was never the same level of gravity as MASH. I think my primary takeaway from Scrubs was doctors and nurses are people too. They are in fact affected by your pain even if they try not to show it. And just like you, they're just trying to make it through the day. Also, how patients can be the worst part of medicine. Does that make sense? I mean, I think a lot of patients see the doctor as the enemy.
Not just as the enemy, but I can see why you'd say that. People, for the most part, unless they've started taking part in preventative medicine, like seeing your acupuncture physician regularly, even when you feel healthy, most people only see their physician in times of illness. You'll show up, you feel cruddy, you wait in a room full of tons of other people for a long time, and then you see your practitioner for a few minutes before either being sent off for more tests or given a prescription and kicked out the door. In these kind of circumstances, it's easy to see the doctor as your enemy. The big white coat and name tag make a good focus for blame and dislike. Scrubs and shows like it have begun humanizing doctors by moving them away from the infallible portrayals they were originally given in shows like Ben Casey, and giving them all the quirks, and frankly, oftentimes more quirks than you'd expect to see, of a regular, everyday human. Is this good? I'm sure to a certain degree it can be, but for the most part, modern shows are apparently leading to patients perceiving their doctors as more uncaring, cold, unfriendly, nervous, tense, and anxious.
Speaking of unfriendly, I think we're definitely going to want to talk about House MD. This is the most recent of the shows we've been talking about. It aired from 2004 to 2012. It's largely about a crack diagnostic team led by a strange man, a drug-addicted, unconventional medical genius who feels contempt for most of humanity. I really don't see how he was allowed to graduate from medical school, despite the genius part. It was a fun show, especially in the early years, watching this crazy guy, Gregory House, ignore every possible rule and law and save patient after patient with his bizarre methods. But the idea that a doctor would be allowed to behave this way for years on end really didn't make any sense to me. Have you watched any episodes of House? How long do you think he'd have kept his license in the real world?
I did watch House, more for the character drama than for the medical aspects of the show. I admit, I relate to grumpy, dark, rude individuals with the intellect to make those foibles worth putting up with. In the real world, Dr. House would probably have kept his license up to and until his first major failure due to a misdiagnosis or an application of some unheard-of off-label treatment, at which point he would have been sued to oblivion and had his license revoked. So basically, he'd likely have been licensed up through the middle of episode 1.
I wondered where House would go. I thought maybe the first season would be him working for the hospital. He'd get sued and then he'd get his license suspended, and then he'd be hired by some wealthy benefactor. So he would just work for this rich guy.
Maybe.
Not be answerable to a medical board. So operating illegally, but still working his magic.
I could see him transferring from patient work to more of a research role. So some company trying to develop a crazy new drug for a specific condition would bring him in, and since he wasn't actively seeing patients, his degree would be enough to let him continue the research without having to deal with additional legal issues. And so they could have him in the background being crazy, but using his genius in an applied way to make them more money.
Totally makes sense to me. Now, this doesn't count as a medical show, but if you gather up all the parts, I think it counts. Early on when the new Star Trek show, Discovery, was about to be announced, I was hoping against hope that it would be a medical show set in the Star Trek continuity. Maybe a hospital on a far-flung planet or on some space station in the distant reaches of space. I mean, the Star Trek universe has unlimited possibilities for TV programs. Anything from a cop drama to a medical show. I'm still waiting for a Star Trek show set in the universe, but not Starfleet or on a ship. That was a long way of saying I love Star Trek doctors. McCoy, Crusher, Bashir, the hologram, Phlox. Like modern doctors, their actions are strongly influenced by the diagnostic equipment at their fingertips, but they have to know what to do with the information. And even in the future, there are things that even these amazing doctors can't cure. What do you think of that? And which Star Trek doctor was your favorite? I gotta go with Dr. Leonard McCoy myself.
Is that the old portrayal of Dr. Leonard McCoy or the new Hoke version?
You know, I think Carl Urban does a great job, so I'll just say Dr. McCoy, period.
Fair enough. The portrayal of future doctors is always interesting to me when I watch them in a film or on TV. They'll usually spout a stream of nonsense with a vaguely medical feel. I need 20 cc's of health juicium and a heart beaterator. And then they'll hook up their patient to an exciting new technological marvel of the day. Computer, give me a full readout of the patient's health down to the molecular level, please. And voila! Seemingly fatal viruses, injuries, decapitations are solved with ease and aplomb. But in every show, no matter how futuristic, no matter how brilliant the doctor or amazing the technology, there are always times when the doctor has done all they can and the patient can't be made well. I think that fact alone gives us incredible insight into the practice of medicine. Even in worlds of fantasy, there's always some new information to be discovered, some critical point at which the best doctors have to throw up their hands in frustration and confusion. As to my favorite Star Trek doctor, I think it's a bit of a toss-up between Phlox and Beverly Crusher. Phlox always struck me as the acupuncture physician of space. He's got a natural remedy for anything, and he bases his treatments on both the best Starfleet technology and the best that his own experience can offer. Beverly Crusher, on the other hand, has a brilliant bedside manner and a tenacity to do the best she can for her patient every time, regardless of race or creed.
Now, be honest if you can. What percentage of your vote for Beverly Crusher comes down to she's a very pretty girl?
Not as much as you might think. I have always appreciated Beverly. I was doing some reading on Star Trek doctors when I was looking over this question because I wanted to make sure I didn't miss one in the list. And one of the articles I read put it really well. Is she's basically the ultimate mom. She's got that I can make everything better just by talking to you sort of vibe. And it's that kind of bedside manner that really kind of takes a doctor over the top. So it's nice that she's a pretty woman, but I think she did a really good job of portraying a real life kind of physician, a balance between being professional when she had to be, but extremely empathetic in connecting with her patients.
Well said. And I think I've only seen a small handful of episodes of Enterprise, so I really can't honestly, say how good or bad Phlox is in my estimation, since I've seen so little of him.
He's fun. I wasn't his biggest fan to start with, but you mentioned in one of the previous questions, he's working with extremely limited supplies and he's having to find a way to make it work. And he's just got this kind of world experience that he's applying. He just seems to know so much about the medicine, even without the high-tech gadgetry.
Is there anything else you want to mention before we wrap it up?
Medical television shows have so much to say for them. In just one podcast, we've managed to discuss topics from orphan drugs to infectious mononucleosis, and then a slew of things in between. And that's all based off of nothing more than a few episodes of television drama. Media can be so much more than just entertainment. When properly utilized, even a comedy like Scrubs, which is designed to catch viewer attention and provide laughs, even Scrubs can contribute to public knowledge on a wealth of subjects. And therein lies both the benefit and the danger. Television is intended to entertain, and maybe to educate. But if enough people believe something that they've heard or seen on a show, and even if the program is clearly not meant to provide an in-depth education, there is the potential for harm. In medical dramas, plenty of people recover from cardiac arrest. CPR saves the drowning victim almost every time, and the crazy last-ditch treatment works just in the nick of time. If these television facts become accepted as truth, then medical practitioners are working against an impossible expectation, and patients aren't understanding the real danger behind their conditions. And the last thing we want is for a patient to fail to put forth efforts on their own behalf to improve their health, because they know, without a doubt, that a Dr. House or a Doogie Howser will be there to save them. So, when you're watching that next episode, enjoy it, but make sure not to take that medical drama too seriously.
That's all the time we have for today. These are short episodes that provide a brief overview of very complex topics. Everything we say is for entertainment and educational purposes only. Licensed healthcare professionals should advise you and be aware about changes you make to any aspect of your healthcare. Every person's needs are different. The links to references we've made about news articles, medical studies, or other materials can be found at level989.com/health, along with our contact information and the complete Don't Take Medical Advice from Podcast disclaimer. Thanks for listening, and now go health yourself.